I am Nathan Willis from Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service. I'm the Operations Senior Ranger for Eastern Downs, Southwest region. So I oversee 2 management bases with 13 staff, managing an area from Crow's Nest in the north through to Girraween National Park in the south and west through to Gundawindi, and a lot of state forests south of Millmerran Woods. So we manage 47 different parcels of land, approximately 280,000 hectares. So we've got 2 parks which form a continuous link with the Toowoomba Range escarpment. We've got Ravensbourne National Park and Crow's Nest National Park. They're about 2,000 to 3,000 hectares in size in total. Compared to the Toowoomba Range escarpment, probably equates to about 5%. The Toowoomba Range escarpment, it's got varying features and vegetation. You're looking at some open sclerophyll forests, then going to subtropical rainforests, which are obviously a fire-sensitive species. You've got quite a steep slope with both east and west facing aspects, so quite steep in the vicinity of sort of 20 to 30% in places, coming up to the top of the Great Dividing Range. Yeah, so the climate Toowoomba is generally subtropical temperatures. We normally end up with a fire season anywhere from September onwards through to December. Outside of that, we sort of go into more humid and wetter influence throughout the summer period. Yeah, that is because of the climatic features, where we tend to get our drier winds that come in from the west and influence stronger winds, lower humidity, and end up dealing with hotter temperatures. Because of the range effect, we end up with multiple variable winds quite a bit. We can get easterly trade winds that influence the range, so we can end up with multiple wind effects just due to the topography and where we are, I guess the great divide between the east and the west. The department's moving towards bushfire management framework. This is when we start looking at planning for fire on the estates and how we set up fire management regimes in a planned approach for national parks and state forests. Obviously, first and foremost, life and property is our statutory obligation with any fire management regime, and then we look at setting up fire zones throughout the national parks. Generally, there's about 4 zones that we work within. So we've got a asset protection zone, so that's having defendable space around assets that we want to ensure that the fire cannot impact. Then we go to a wildfire mitigation zone. That's about trying to prevent the spread of wildfire through the landscape. So what we'll look at doing there is reducing fuel loads to the point where fire can be suppressed or assists with the suppression of fire in the landscape. We've also got land management zones, which is for conservation or sustainable production purposes, and that's where we're looking at putting fire regimes that are suitable for the vegetation types that are there and trying to assist with biodiversity in the landscape. If we start at a fire sensitive species like rainforest, we're trying to totally exclude fire. We'll try and mitigate fuels adjoining that particular vegetation type to prevent fire impacting on the edges. Rainforest is obviously very important. It's a species which dates back tens of thousands of years and has its own structure and has its own unique values. The fourth area is areas that have wet sclerophyll, and wet sclerophyll along the Toowoomba Range escarpment is an endangered vegetation type. It generally doesn't like fires going through, but it can handle fires probably every 50 years going through. Reducing fuel in that zone is quite difficult as it does stay wet for longer on the Toowoomba Range escarpment and can prove to be a very difficult vegetation type to actually conduct a planned burn. Next to national parks, it is a challenge managing some of the multi-land use types that actually adjoin or abut onto national park estate. Some of the state forest has lessees that have agri-businesses on them. It can be cleared country that can assist in places for fire management, but then we go into peri-urban areas where we've got built up residential areas that do butt onto forest estate, and that can prove a challenge in trying to prevent fires from impacting on neighbouring properties. Due to the nature of some of the range escarpments, it's quite difficult to have good established fire breaks in some of our boundaries. So we do work in with the neighbours up there in places where we can establish fire breaks. So we've got a mutual fire break network system. We work in with our neighbours under what we call the good neighbour policy to conduct a planned fire. We can do that where we will actually approach them and look at it, trying to get a mutual outcome for fire management on the ground. And we've certainly had neighbours approach QP&WS to working together. So working with small blocks, the planning process can take place leading into the fire season. Depends on the size of the burn we're conducting. It can involve having to establish some fire breaks and looking at linkages where we can tie into natural fire barriers, rainforest, etc. As an example, we'll use our own machinery, so we do have a tractor slasher and we've also got heavy earth moving equipment. A lot of the fire breaks are already in place, and so sometimes it is just touching those up. We do request that the landholders are there on the day to provide assistance and that local knowledge. Many landholders do have that historical knowledge in some of those areas. Farmers definitely do upgrade their own fire breaks. So in terms of contact prior to any planned burn, we'd go and make contact, meet neighbours on their properties, so we're talking the same language and at the same points. If it's close to an urban area, we'll go put community service announcement through local ABC radio just to let residents know that there may be smoke in the area, and anyone with respiratory issues can stay indoors for that fire period until the smoke subsides. In terms of our staffing, we can involve rural fire units to get that planned burn done, and that's using our local rural fire members. They've got local knowledge and history of fire in the areas and come with some really good skill sets to assist us in getting an outcome. For a burn on the Toowoomba Range escarpment, we would have 5 what we call light attack fire units, 2 people per crew, so we end up with 8 people operationally and an incident controller. The Rural Fire Brigade would normally bring in 1 or 2 trucks, which can have up to 4 people per truck, and so we end up with another 8 people. So we can have up to 16 to 20 people on a burn on the Toowoomba Range escarpment. We would involve the neighbours to a point where they had the resources available, or if they were able to provide assistance. In terms of risks for conducting planned burns, one of the biggest risks to our operational staff is hazardous trees that are falling during the fire operation, and that's for our staff and anyone who may traverse past that area after the burn. Fire can enter into the hollows and dry sides of timber, catch on, and then make that tree fall down. Unless it's been identified, it could pose a risk to staff on the ground. In terms of fire getting away, we use fire modelling and burn at appropriate times to actually ensure that we don't have fires leaving the planned area. The risks on the escarpment of fire getting away are fuel where we've got ribbon fuels, which are fuels which actually come down from the canopy of the tree. Fuel can spot outside the area, and that can be a risk. To mitigate against the slope, we generally try and burn down the slope. Fire burning down the slope will be at a lower intensity and rate as opposed to fire running up the slope. What we're looking for is a mosaic burn, which is a patchy burn throughout the forest. We're looking at somewhere between 40 and 80% of what we call the duff layer to be removed, which is the vegetation layer on the ground, then the mid-story up to your knees where you've got grasses and those sort of fuels. So we're looking to try and reduce those below 5 tonnes per hectare. So when you get 5 going up into the canopy, it's a higher intensity, a lot more difficult to contain. Lantana is a major problem with fire management on the Toowoomba Range escarpment. It is a invasive, thick cover weed, and it actually is a fire suppressant to a point, but once the vegetation dries out, it actually does become part of the fuel ladder and can increase fire behaviour. So it does actually create like its own microclimate under the leaves, and so when we're having wet years like we are this year, it actually makes the duff layer, it actually makes it wetter for longer, which means the window for conducting a planned burn is actually decreased. When lantana dries off, it becomes more fuel and can be a higher fuel load through that area and can become problematic with spotting. The management of the lantana and after a fire is difficult and can be replaced by other weeds if the fire does go through. What we can do is implement fire regimes more frequently to try and create an environment that's suitable for grasses to come back, which were there in the first place. The role of fire in the landscape for Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service is to provide healthy forest environments. A lot of native species, you need fire to regenerate. That increases biodiversity and assists species in that environment. We're conducting